You're very welcome to the One Movement's inaugural webinar event hosted by the Galway Council of Trade Unions, of course. And my name is Marion Spellman, and I am President of the Council, and I'm going to be your moderator this evening. So I welcome you all here this evening. It's wonderful to have people watching from all around the country as well. So basically, for any of you who don't know, One Movement is a network of trade unions at county level, working in collaboration and cooperative ways within workplaces and communities. It includes One Cork and Galway, along with 15 active trades councils, which are, of course, all around the country, north and south. This is the very first, so at least I have no one to be up against. This is my first, so if I screw up, you will be kind. And it's part of our One Future, One Vision webinar series. And our topic tonight is, of course, an income to live on, which is not only topical, of course, but it's very crucial to ensure workers have access to decent working conditions in order to achieve a decent standard of living, which is what we all want, basically. And it's, of course, a core pillar of the priorities of the trade union movement. But before we kick off, right, I want to give you a little detail about the whole series, because this is the first of many. Because each month, a trades council from across the country will host a session for approximately 1 hour. So don't worry, it won't keep you any longer than that. And we're going to discuss issues of importance to workers, such as the impact of Brexit on port and ferry workers, which will be hosted next month by the Wexford Trades Council. And of course, the importance of apprenticeships, particularly for young workers, and that will be hosted by Cork in December. Now, next year, we will move on to other topics, such as health and safety implications of COVID-19, of which we, of course, are in the middle of a massive pandemic, and it would appear to be a second wave. So it's something that's going to be very much at the forefront of people's minds. Also, the need for greater investment in our public services, a just transition, and union recognition and collective bargaining. So for all of us, you need to keep in touch with your union, who will inform you of the dates and times of these events as they come up. Now, of course, we've got 4 fantastic people on the panel tonight, and I'm going to just introduce you a little bit to each of them, and then we can start, if that's okay with everyone. So first and foremost, I'd like to introduce Daniel Howard, and I'd like to welcome Daniel, who is coming to us from London. So thank you very much, Daniel, for that. You are a programme manager for the Living Wage Foundation in London. And prior to this, Daniel worked for the Joseph, which is an independent social change organisation working to solve UK poverty. Prior to that, he interned at the Department of Work and Pensions. So you have a wealth of policy and campaign experience in this field, Daniel, and I certainly look forward to listening to your contribution. After that, we have Terence Mcdonough. Now, Terence is I have to say, absolutely so what you call it, I run out of words, Terence, because I think I'm a bit intimidated by all your intellect, and by everyone's that's here tonight. So Terence Mcdonough, you're an Emeritus Professor of Economics at NUI Galway. You're also a member of SIPTU, and you serve on the Secretariat of Galway City Community Network. And I know you have a lot more there behind you, but if I went through it all, we'd be here half the night. So after that, we also have, I want to welcome Dolores McKenna, who is a mandate steward with Tesco in Tullamore. She's an elected member of the Mandate Executive Council, a role which you have held for many years, and you represent the Western Division. Dolores has a wealth of experience dealing with issues of low pay, precarious work, and insecure hours. And we definitely look forward to hearing from her and your insight into this issue, Dolores. And last, but by no means least, John Carty. I would like to welcome to our panel. John has worked with the Mandate Trade Union as a divisional organiser for over 20 years. Now, prior to that, he was the de facto full-time senior shop steward of the AEEU, which is now part of Unite, the union, in an American multinational in Galway. John is still a member of Unite, and for a number of years was elected Unite shop steward for Mandate's divisional organisers. You have a keen interest in studying academic industrial relations, and you have 2 diplomas, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, a higher diploma, and a PhD. I'm tired even just thinking about it. So, John, you have both practical and theoretical knowledge of this topic, and I look forward to the wealth of experience that you bring to our discussion as well tonight. Now, very briefly, and because I won't go on for too long, because you don't want to be listening to me, you want to listen to the people who know what they're talking about. Some very minor housekeeping issues. And I know that probably you're all set up with Zooms and webinars and WebExes and everything. So we don't intend holding you longer than 1 hour maximum. But we do want to hear from you. So after all the speakers have made their contributions, we're going to take questions from you all. You can post your question to us using the chat function, which you will find on the bottom of your screen, which kind of looks like a speech bubble. So if you enter your question by text there, we'll ask your question of the panelists. So don't be afraid to ask. So without further ado, I would like to ask Daniel to make your contributions now. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Marion, for that introduction. Thank you as well to One Movement for asking me to speak on this webinar and to putting together this work on living income. I think it's really encouraging to see organisations talking about good work and living standards at a time when we're faced with unprecedented challenges of our economies and societies. So I think it's more important now than ever that we keep these issues on the agenda to ensure that this pandemic and its fallout don't result in a race to the bottom in terms of what workers can expect from their employers. So yeah, as Marion mentioned, I'm Dan Howard, and I'm the lead on the Living Wage Foundation's Living Hours programme, which seeks to tackle underemployment and insecurity of working hours. So I'm going to provide a bit of background to the campaign for a real living wage in the UK and the role of the Living Wage Foundation here. I'll then speak a little bit about our new Living Hours programme, which provides practical solutions and employers can adopt to provide their workers with the security and stability of hours they need to make continue. So the Living Wage campaign in the UK has been fighting for wages that meet the real cost of living since 2001. Sorry, I've got a message about my sound. I'll try taking my headphones off to make sense. So the campaign began when a group of people from churches, mosques, schools and synagogues across East London met in a community hall to talk about the issues affecting their lives. The hall is a short ride away from Canary Wharf, an area that has seen huge change over the past few decades. So when the docks closed in the 1980s, many skilled jobs were lost, and whilst regeneration brought significant investment from the financial property sectors, many of the people in that hall felt that they had not benefited from this. So house prices soared and the jobs available to them in these new financial services buildings were too often minimum wage positions as cleaners or security guards. And at the time, the minimum wage was just £3.70 an hour. So many of these people were working full time, working in 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs, but still not earning enough to live on. So the campaign for employers to pay a real living wage came out of that room, based on the idea that a hard day's work deserves a fair day's pay. The Living Wage Foundation was founded in 2011 to oversee the calculation of the living wage, accredit employers paying the rate, and to influence others to do so. And there are now over 6,500 accredited living wage employers in the UK, ranging from household names like IKEA, HSBC, and Liverpool Football Club to thousands of SMEs across the country. And the campaign has put over 1.2 billion back into the pockets of around 250,000 low-paid workers. So moving on to speak a little bit about living hours. We recognise that making ends meet is not just about the pay you receive for every hour that you work, but is also dependent on the number and regularity of the hours that you work. So a couple of years ago, as we started to hear more and more stories about the impact insecure work was having on workers, we started to look into what more employers could do to tackle in-work poverty through making jobs more secure. And research earlier this year actually highlighted the extent of the problem of insecure work in the UK. So it found there's 1 in 6 workers in the UK are low-paid and insecure work, which equates to around 5.1 million people, 2 million of which are actually parents, so have caring responsibilities and people that rely on them. And 1.3 million of these workers in low-paid insecure work have been designated key workers in the response to the coronavirus pandemic. So what that really shows is that, there's a lot of, this is a real issue in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same in Ireland as well, and we'll be hearing a lot more about that later on. So at the same time as we were hearing these stories of workers suffering in insecure work, our network of living wage employers were asking us what more they could do to support workers in insecurity. And after talking extensively to employers, workers, labour experts and trade unions, we developed Living Hours. So Living Hours is a practical and stretching standard that employers can adopt to give workers predictable, stable hours so that they and their families have real control of their lives. Pay is obviously the most important step to ensure a decent standard of living, but living hours is really the other side of the coin. And that's where we're calling on large employers who can to ensure their staff, including those that they employ indirectly, so third-party contracted staff, receive three basic measures. So the three measures that constitute living hours are decent notice periods for shifts of at least 4 weeks with guaranteed payment if shifts are cancelled within this notice period, the right to switch to a contract that reflects the actual hours that you work, a guaranteed minimum of 16 hours a week unless the worker requests otherwise. So as I mentioned, we didn't get to these measures on our own. We've sought the advice of workers, experts and employers and trade unions, and it's been a considered process. And we know that implementing living hours is going to be challenging for lots of employers. In many cases, it requires not only a change to employment practice, but also to organisational culture. So it means building relationships with employees based on dignity and respect, as well as shaping employment cultures with shared responsibility and reciprocity at their heart. It really means giving workers a choice about the type of work they want. So whether this be flexibly, and we know that lots of workers, flexible work is the right thing, and we don't want to undermine the autonomy of workers, or security and stability. So through working with the employers to implement living hours, we've developed the knowledge and sort of expertise necessary to go through them and implement the measures with these employers. But we've also seen the benefits to workers of implementing measures. So workers at Aviva, one of the first living hours accredited employers, impacted by the measures, said that knowing when and how often they work enables them to plan better financially and balance commitments outside of work. And they also think that these changes to how their work is organised will impact them in the long term as well, by enabling them to plan their lives and manage family responsibilities. We launched Living Hours in June 2019, and just last week we announced Aviva and Standard Life Aberdeen as the first accredited Living Hours employers. So through this commitment, these employers will provide their directly employed and regular third-party contracted staff with Living Hours measures. And this now means that over 20,000 workers in the UK now have certainty over their working hours and shifts. I think we should clear that we're still in the early stages of this work, and in many ways, providing workers with living hours is going to be more complex than implementing the living wage. We see the issue of insecure work as the next step in protecting workers from work poverty, giving them certainty over income and shift patterns necessary to make ends meet. And we know that insecure work is a systemic problem. One that's become entrenched in the way that many organisations operate. Living out is really a way for responsible employers to show that things can be done differently. It doesn't happen the way that it has been, and provides a benchmark of good practice on working hours and notice periods. What is this is shifting the balance in terms of what employers can expect from their employers. So we go from a relationship of one-sided flexibility with the worker bearing the burden of this flexibility to the employer recognising their staff employed human beings with life outside of work. So it's working hard over the coming months to grow the campaign and get more employers providing their staff with living hours alongside the living wage. That's all I'm going to say for today. Apologies if there was problems with the sound. I hope it sorted itself out towards the end. Thank you. I'm back to you, Mariam.
Thanks so much, Dan. I know much and all as we did hear, I think I heard most of that. There was a little bit, but don't worry, everything like this is new. We're living a new world. We're communicating differently. We're learning how to, communicate with each other across the water, shall we say, without having to meet face to face. But thank you for your contribution. It was absolutely fascinating. I know we'll have questions after everything, but for the moment, I'd like to call on Terence to speak to us now. Thank you, Terence.
Sure. Dan has just made the case for living wages and living hours, and made that case from the perspective of the benefits that these things bring to the ordinary worker, the ordinary employee, the person who needs to make a living essentially from their employment. What I want to do in my 10 minutes is to talk about the major objection that you might encounter in campaigning for a living wage, or alternately increasing maybe inconvenience to an employer in providing living hours. And the major objection turns out to be from economists, or not really from economists, because economists are divided on this question, but from people who like to think they're quoting economists. And what I'm going to argue is that, in fact, what they're not quoting is, or specific experts on the economy, what they're quoting is textbooks. And what they're giving you is a textbook economic argument. And I bring this up not because we should be paying a lot of attention to textbooks, but because this argument is what comes out of the mouths of politicians when they have to explain why they are, for some reason, opposed to providing a living income for working people. And the textbook argument goes like this. It says, wages at the low end of the market are set by the supply of labor and the demand for labor. Supply and demand. The supply of labor depends on what people are willing to work for, and the demand for labor depends on its productivity, that is, the amount of economic return it brings to the employer. And so the wage rate in this argument is set where the supply of labor equals the demand for labor. So it's set where people are willing to work, the wage people are willing to work for equals their productivity for the employer. And the argument goes that a minimum wage or minimum income, or really anything which inconveniences the employer, will set the wage or the worker's income above that worker's productivity, that is, above the amount of revenue that the employee can generate for the employer. And if the wage is higher than the revenue, this will cause the employer to lay off the employee or alternately replace them with machines. So while the living wage will increase the incomes of those who stay employed, this argument goes, it will cause others to become unemployed and driving their wage down to zero. What usually follows this argument is an expression of tremendous political sympathy for those poor workers who don't have high productivity and would be laid off in the event of an increase in wages. So the argument here from the textbook is that living wages don't work in theory. The questions you need to ask are, one, is the theory correct? And two, does it work in the real world? Well, the theory is not correct. It may be the theory in the textbook, but I don't think the real world of the economy works this way. Wages are not set in impersonal markets by supply and demand. Wages, as we know in the union movement, are set in a bargaining process between the employer and the employee. And this is true even where a union is not involved and people are signing individual contracts. It all comes down to the bargaining power of the worker. Firms then set prices at a level which are high enough to cover that wage bill. To the extent that productivity and wages are related, it works the other way around. Productivity does not determine wages, as the textbook argument says. Rather, employers organize the employment so that the process is productive enough to cover the wages which are agreed between the employer and the employee, or between the employer and the union, or between the employer and the state in the event of minimum wage or living wage laws. So that low wages, and here's the point, low wages lead to low productivity because they allow the employer to organize the work process in such a way that it's not too terribly productive. Conversely, high wages lead to high productivity. High wages, it's widely agreed, have incentive effects. They motivate people to work harder. They attract higher skilled workers to the employment, and they reduce employee turnover, lowering hiring and training costs. So that the living wage is not necessarily a burden on the employer. On the contrary, there are benefits to the employer which come from paying a reasonable return on people's labor. Importantly, the textbook argument ignores demand effects. That is, if people are paid more, they spend more. And if people spend more, there's more demand in the economy and more jobs available. This is especially true at lower ends of the wage scale, where people are not taking home huge amounts of money and consequently are not topping up their savings every week when their paycheck comes in. Rather, what they're doing is turning their paycheck over and increasing demand for employers' products and services in the markets. So more spending creates more jobs, higher wages creates more spending. The second question we have to ask of these arguments against living wages is, do they work in practice? That is, something might be all right in theory, although I've just argued it isn't. But even if it were all right in theory, the question you have to ask is, does it work in practice? High wage periods in history, if you go back, for instance, to the period, the 30 years after the Second World War, these high wage periods, with high unionization, by the way, also had low unemployment rates. Lower wage periods, like the last 30 years, have had higher unemployment rates. There have been a number of studies which have been undertaken to see whether or not this argued effect, that is, a minimum wage or a living wage, will create less employment. The studies look to see whether in actual cases, in actual economies, this lower employment effect actually showed itself. And what they discover is, despite the textbook argument, that it doesn't. One major study concluded, quote, "It appears that if negative effects on employment are present, they are too small to be statistically detectable." So the argument doesn't work in practice. Importantly, minimum wages lower inequality. And they lower inequality across a couple of different dimensions. They lower inequality among wage earners by raising the floor on wages. Now, this is going to benefit not just people on the minimum wage or people on the minimum living income. What it does is bump wages up across the ladder of remuneration in the private sector. Minimum wages also work as a wealth transfer from shareholders and franchisees to minimum wage workers, lowering inequality. So in conclusion, don't allow opponents of the living wage to cite economics. If this is going on, if they're doing this, they're just parroting a dubious textbook model with very little application in the real world. And there are many economists who are fervent supporters of raising wage levels through legal action. Thank you.
Thank you, Terence. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think what I took from it anyways myself was that people before profit actually benefits all of society. But that's a very simplified view my own simplified view of that. And I work for the public sector, so we always try to put people before profit. But again, it doesn't work everywhere. But thank you so much for that, Terence. That was absolutely fantastic. And I think as well that it's really important to hear about the impact that such decisions have on workers. And Dolores, who is coming up next, you have a wealth of experience with your role as a shop steward. And of course, you see the detrimental effect on your colleagues on the ground. So Dolores, over to you, please. Thank you.
How are you? Good evening, everybody. I was asked to talk about what I thought about the living income, and I suppose, like most of the participants have said here, it's a combination, I suppose, of a living wage and a decent contracted band of hours or contracted hours that are giving you a stability. So rather than having our zero contract hours, is what seems to be dismissing anyone or any retailer that is given a decent per hour wage. So one without the other will leave an unstable wage for your regular worker. So I guess in our own store, we're probably reasonably well looked after, and we would have had introduced to us in 2006 a band of hours where it would protect the staff member that they would not be put under a minimum of 20 hours a week. So it gives them a stability that they know that they're on either a 20 or a 25 or a 30 or 35 hour working week. And given that with the minimum wage, some of the retailers will offer maybe a €12 an hour start off pay, but they may only offer a 16-hour week, which will leave the person probably working over a 4 day week, which will leave them without being able to top up their wages with any social welfare benefits or any kind of support. So I find that in a lot of stores where Dunnes Stores members would have helped bring through in 2017 the 2017 contract of 0 hour contracts. The bill went through and they found that sometimes that the retailers were still finding loopholes, even though this bill has been passed through government. And a lot of stores that don't have representation in their areas will find that they will not be looked after by the employer. They will find loopholes, they will kind of ignore their request. And that's also where we find where we're finding a lot of retailers also and employers are not allowing trade unionists to be represented in the workplace. That seems to be something that seems to be coming up quite a lot as well. So.
Thank you, Dolores. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. Are you okay there?
Yeah. No, that's all I have to add to it. Sorry.
Oh, no, that was absolutely perfect. No, I was just thinking there about, we had an issue a few years ago with 0 hour contracts where they used it for locum workers, but they didn't have the rights of people who had proper contracts. So I remember, I think it might be a few years ago, that the trade unions and all the different unions collaborated to ensure that 0 hour contracts, now I know they're still there in private sector, but the public sector has improved quite a lot. I don't know, John, if you remember that a few years ago. With 0 hour contracts where people were not sure when they were working, or they might be told the week before you're needed for this. You couldn't have a social life, you couldn't even get a mortgage, you couldn't be sure of what where you were going to be next week. So the likes of 0 hour contracts, it has a huge detrimental effect on people's mental health as well as their social life and all their their long-term goals as well that we'd all like to have as we go along in life. So thanks so much to that, Dolores. That was absolutely fantastic. And I have to say, so far all our panelists have been phenomenal. And last but not least, Mr. John party. As we know, John is, I'd like to ask you to speak and perhaps tell us what campaigns mandate are progressing in this area and what we can do, of course, to support such campaigns. So thank you so much, John.
Thank you, Chair. There's three parts to my presentation. The first part is just a quick history of how casualisation of the retail trade occurred in Irish retail. Second part is the precarious retail work in operation, and the final part is just some observations I have. A quick history. In the mid-90s, many retail employers sought to extend their trading for the Christmas Sundays. These would be the 4 Sundays in Christmas and maybe 1 or 2 in November, and to increase the amount of extra late nights that their shops would open. This was all done through agreement with the trade union mandate in what was called local town agreements, rather than single employer agreements. And these local town agreements had existed prior to the mid-90s Christmas trading coming into place. Basically, each trade agreement in each location would mean that all the workers in a particular location working in retail would be on the same rate of pay. So all retail workers in Galway were on the same rate of pay. Same thing for Athlone, same thing for Limerick, Cork, wherever, right? Not only in pay, but also in relation to sick pay, pension schemes, holiday entitlements. And they were covered by these town agreements, whether they worked in a Dunnes Stores or a Tesco or an individual SuperValu. Frequently, these agreements also had ratios in relation to the amount of part-timers that could be employed in any particular retail outlet. However, in the late 1990s, these town agreements were radically altered by mandate. And our argument at the time was, why should a pennies worker in Letterkenny be on lesser terms and conditions of employment than a pennies worker in Cork or Dublin? Eventually, mandate won that argument. But in exchange, we had to concede that the large employers could trade Sundays and late nights at their discretion throughout the rest of the 52 weeks of the year. So the effect of all of this was the 24-hour, 7-day trading had arrived in Irish retail, and during some years of the Celtic Tiger, many stores, Dunnes and Tesco particularly, in their larger outlets were trading on a 24/7 basis. Dolores' store would be one of them. Now, in the context, while all this was going on, the IDA and other state agencies quietly stopped incoming multinationals to recognise trade unions for collective bargaining purposes. This is well documented in relation to American multinationals coming into the country in the manufacturing and pharmaceutical industries, but it's less well documented in relation to retail. Another factor that was at play was due to the peace process and the resulting ceasefires, many UK-based retailers entering the country were no longer discouraged from adopting a non-unionised approach. When Marx came in during the 80s, at the height of the Troubles, they were told the last thing you want to do is the first major retailer from the UK to come in for years is take on an Irish union. So Marx, unlike their attitude to industrial relations in the UK, immediately did a collective agreement with mandate. So as foreign capital started to invest in Irish retail throughout the country, many did so without any engagement with Irish trade unions or local town agreements I previously mentioned. So in the course of 2 decades, Irish retail, like many other sectors, has changed radically in relation to how terms and conditions of employment were negotiated and regulated. So precarious work came into many sectors in Irish industry. So the second part is just retail operation regarding precarious employment. The result of these developments is that in recent years, a retail worker is rarely, if ever, offered a full-time contract. And many workers seeking to be hired in a particular shop have to agree to be available 7 days a week, and in some stores, 24 hours a day. Take Dunnes Stores, for example. Dunnes Stores don't hire day shift workers and night shift workers like most other retailers. Dunnes just hire workers. So you could be told by roster, next week you are on nights after 10, 20 years of being a so-called day shift worker. This is because the unequal bargaining power in labour markets, including retail. Employers can offer contracts that commit a particular worker commit a worker to a particular employer, but only commit the employer to offer work at times it suits the employer's business. So the worker, because of their weakness in the labour market, has to agree to carry most, if not all, of the economic risk in return for the job offer. The agreed hourly rate can be set by law, such as minimum wage, individual negotiations between the worker and the employer before the work commences, collective bargaining if there's a union in the place, but frequently it's set by the employer on a basis of take it or leave it. But not only do we need to concentrate on the rate of pay, the hourly rate of pay, but also to how that affects, and the amount of hours, how that affects earnings. In that the hourly rate of pay can be increased, but the number of hours a worker is rostered can be decreased at the same time. So their overall earnings, whether they're paid weekly or monthly, can actually fall. So for any form of economic security, the risk of huge fluctuations in the number of hours part-time workers are rostered must be eliminated. Mandate has some success in this. Duns used to hire part-time workers on the 0-hour contracts. So a Duns worker could be rostered for any amount of hours. None, 0, right up to the full-time equivalent of 39. And Duns were not breaking any law or employment contract. In Tesco, it was any amount of hours between 18 and 39. In Pennies, any amount between 11 and 39. The 0 hours in Duns were eliminated in 1995 because Mandate was successful in a 3-week strike. The 18 to 39 hour band in Tesco and 11 to 39 in Pennies were eliminated in 2006 and 2016 respectively due to reaching of agreements on banded hours. However, Duns will not engage in negotiations on banded hours and continue to roster part-timers between 15 and 39 hours. Mandate in 2015 attempted to force Duns into a banded hour agreement with a 1-day strike, but while that was unsuccessful, Mandate was able to mobilise its members in Duns to engage in a political campaign to have the law changed in relation to banded hours. This political campaign was successful and resulted in what's known, or what's called the Employment Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2018, or more commonly known as the Banded Hours legislation or Banded Hours law. That's just how banded hours and precarious work operate in retail. Some of my own observations in this respect. Employers sometimes have legitimate operational reasons to reduce a part-time worker's hours, such as after a busy period like Christmas or some other seasonal reason, or after a busy sale. However, the whole issue of employers' power to reduce hours has other consequences. As I've stated, employers have more power because of their position in the labour market. But because of this power, they also can enhance their actual power within a particular workplace as well as the external labour market. Employers can cut a part-time hours and thus their earnings for other reasons. If the worker insists on something that they are entitled to under their contract of employment or under employment law. If the worker raises a grievance about some aspect of the job. If the employer just wants that particular worker to resign for some reason. They're all used as a form or a method of informal discipline, where the worker doesn't have the same rights to natural justice and fair procedures that might be contained in a more formal disciplinary procedure. This is all intended to create a fearful and a more docile workforce. It also is used to keep workers from joining and becoming active in a trade union. Actually, what they need to do is actually join and become active in trade unions. I'll finish by mentioning the EU Directive on Unfair Terms in Consumer Contracts, 93/13 EEC. This was enacted in Ireland, in the Republic, in 1995 by a statutory instrument. The directive provides that a contract may be unfair if it is drafted in advance without the consumer's influence and contains a term or terms that are binding on the consumer but at the seller's discretion. If one replaces the words consumer and seller for employee and employer respectively, such an EU directive would eliminate most forms of precarious employment contracts. However, contracts of employment are explicitly excluded from this EU consumer directive. Because of the Directive's exclusion of contracts of employment, EU employers are still able to draw up an advance before any job offer is made, the contract, without the worker's input, and can include any amount of clauses that are binding on the worker but at the discretion of the employer. Perhaps it's time the trade union movement started a campaign that workers in the EU should have the same protection as consumers in the EU regarding unfair contracts. It'll be interesting to see how the EU institutions would respond to such a campaign. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That was very informative. And can I just ask any of thank you to all the panelists, first of all, to Dan, Terence, to Dolores, to John. They were absolutely fantastic presentations. I have to say I learned an awful lot from them as well. But just to let all our attendees know that if you have any questions, you can text it in and we will ask all our panelists. John, seeing as you were the last person to speak there, can I just ask a question that came in? How can the battle for better pay be won, and what's your view of legislation versus organising, and of course what should be the focus of the movement? You're on mute, John.
Right. Unions have always used legislation and collective bargaining. The example I gave there in relation to Duns, what we couldn't get through collective bargaining, we got through legislation. The difficulty with the legislation approach is it takes longer to achieve. The advantage is once it's achieved, it's more immune to fluctuations in the market than an employer wanting to renegotiate agreements. But I would fundamentally believe that it's through collective bargaining and organising is the approach unions should do. Legislation will be brought in at a minimum level. As Dolores said, there'll be loopholes in it. And the other thing is it drags industrial relations out of the workplaces and puts them in the courts. Even the lower courts in relation to WRC and the Labour Court, if something was legally binding and the employer wanted, they could appeal it into the civil courts, circuit, high court, Supreme Court even, because they have deeper pockets. I think the struggle belongs in the workplace rather than the courtroom.
Okay, thank you, John. That stabilises, I suppose, people's lives as well, which makes it better for them. Dolores, can I just ask you as well a question? The retail sector doesn't always have such low levels of pay. What has happened with workers on the ground, and what do you think needs to change?
So I think, I suppose, what might need to change would be more of a unite, say for the workers to have a recognition of their unions in the workplace. Now, while we would be quite a strong unionised shop, known for, I work in Tesco, sorry, just in case I missed it. We find in the latter years that you will find that our agreements that are already there have been jeopardised in certain circumstances. And if I needed John to come down to speak to me or to speak to a member of staff at the moment, John can't come into my shop to come in and represent me as a mandate member or a trade union member. It's not just a mandate issue. I'm sure it's over quite a lot of trade unionist areas and workplaces. But I think it's very important that for, I suppose, for a regional or for to be able to have your trade union come in and represent your concerns, whether it be on pay being probably, and obviously the band of hours are the two big things for you to achieve, a decent wage. So I think that's something that's very important. I think we have a younger generation out there that will see this and will become good activists for this. We have this kind of middle pot of workers that have had the good conditions fought for, like John has many of an example, when Christmas hours opened and when night trading opened. And like Terence would have said, the demand was there. So the employer would have come and agreed to give you almost anything, as the saying is, to get to achieve what they needed at the time. So I think at the moment, a lot of retailers are doing quite well at the moment. I know there's smaller businesses, possibly not, but say in the retail sector that I'm in, they're doing quite well at the moment. and they are probably finding a bit more power, you know, not wanting to talk to unions and that because they feel that they don't want to recognise or have to sit down and have to admit that they have plenty of money in the pot. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Doris. I think actually everyone should be part of a trade union, whether it's the public sector or private sector. I think not just being part of a collaboration, but also having the information that goes with it and knowing your rights, I think is the most important part of being part of a trade union for me anyways, knowing what your rights are and knowing what you can fight for and knowing the difference between them. Thank you so much. Terry, given your argument regarding the beneficial impact of a living wage or higher wages, is employer opposition purely concerned with short-term profit, and how can we argue it? Unmute, Terry. Can you unmute yourself there, Terry? Thank you.
There we go. That's a good question because it goes really to the center of the impact of wages on the economy and through the economy on the employers, that the employer has an interest in their wages being as minimal as possible or as low as possible, but everyone else employing workers should pay them a good deal, because that way you benefit both from low wages in your workplace, but high wages in everyone else's enterprise. So that individual employers will have a tendency to pursue lower wage levels in their own enterprises. And in a certain sense, it's beneficial to employers in general and the economy in general if trade unions are there to drive up wages across the board. Because after all, who's going to buy the employer's product? Who's going to shop in the employer's store? Who's going to have meals in the employer's franchise restaurant, if not people who are earning wages? So it's important that wages be high enough in the economy in general, and we can't rely on individual employers to solve that problem. What we really need is collective action on the part of employees. It's also possible to approach this question through legislation, and I think it's perfectly appropriate that legislation of this kind be pursued and ultimately passed. I think John is obviously right that if you're not well organized on the shop floor level, you're not going to do very well in the end. But the existence of this kind of legislation does alter the balance of power between employers and employees, and I think it's important.
Thank you, Terence. Now, Dan, I sent you actually a couple of questions there. I don't know if you got them. And but one of them was, what's the mechanism under which the groups collaborated for the living wage and living hours?
So by the groups, Marion, do you mean the employers or how different parties came together?
The groups, just a question that came in there. What's the mechanism under which the groups, I think, that you work with collaborated for the living wage and living hours? How did you work together?
Yeah, so I mean, we on the living wage. I mean, the living wage campaign has been going for 20 years now. Probably not as much of an offer on that as I could be on sort of living hours. On the living hours side, what I can say is that we sort of went through a period of consultation at the start of this work. So we spoke with trade unions, employers, and workers to understand the challenges they were facing and try to up the standard for what good would look like in this area. And we continue to sort of have those groups involved in living hours. So we have a sort of steering group which oversees the project, and that's made up of trade unions, employers, and other campaigners. So they sort of have constant oversight over the work, and getting their buy-in is really important to the campaign being a success and to more employers adopting living hours as well.
Okay, quick. Dan, do the living wage employers recognise trade unions and engage in collective bargaining?
Yeah, definitely. So trade unions have been part of the living wage campaign since it started. Back in 2001. And the TUC in the UK sits on our living wage advisory council. So they sort of oversee the calculation of the living wage rate and are involved in that process and are very, heavily involved in that. And I mean, what I would say is that, we work with trade unions a lot, and, the campaign is based on the idea that the living wage is the minimum that people should expect from their employer. So trade unions should be involved in winning things above and beyond that. The real living wage is the minimum that people should get. We're active with trade unions, and many trade unions use the living wage as a sort of basis for what they make, for what they ask for in their bargaining. We have a very close relationship with the trade unions, and they are very much involved in the processes.
That's great, Dan. Thanks so much. And I think it also shows everyone here has shown how important being part of a trade union is, knowing what a trade union does and what you can get out of it. But to be honest with you, it's like paying membership for a gym. If you want to see the benefit, you actually have to go and you have to join and you have to participate. And I think part of it, like Dolores there, she's a very active member, elected member as well. John has been part of Mandate for years. I'm part of IMNO. Terence, you're part of SIP2. So like all the unions here, and I know a lot of people watching, Forza as well, I know a few from Forza there watching in. So it just shows you how important unions are for workers. Because at the end of the day, as Terence said, profits come before people in a lot of places. We need to look at putting people before profits. And as he also said, I think when you do respect people and pay them properly, they put it back in our society, and it's better for everybody. So I have to say, I think that's the most important thing that I took from today as well. And I know we do have to wrap up, but before I wrap up, first and foremost, I want to thank so much Terence, Dan, John, and Dolores. And of course to Hazel, our moderator, who was doing all the technology, and also to Forza, who actually facilitated all this as well through ICTU, and Fiona Dunn, of course, who is our national organiser with One Cork and One Galway. So I think we have another question there for Dan. Hang on a second now. This is what happens. Apparently, hang on a second. We will get to it. I think this is what I love about technology, because it comes and it goes. I might end up not being able to find that. So I think it just said, I think you answered that one about recognising trade unions and engaging in collective bargaining, Dan. So can I just say, everyone has said thank you so much. It was extremely informative. Fiona, yes, thank you.
There is another question that I sent directly to Dan.
Okay.
If I can find it out. It's to do with social insurance supports.
Did you get that, Dan?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question if we've got time. In the calculation of the real living wage, which is done by the Resolution Foundation here in the UK, the benefit system is taken into account. So all those things are sort of the universal credit system that we have, which has recently been put in place here, which has had obviously lots of challenges associated with it. But all taken into account in the calculation of the living wage rates. What it basically means is that no one will be worse off by being paid the living wage. So that's all sort of taken into account with it. And when we were developing living hours, the particular issue here is with the minimum number of hours and how that affects your benefits claimants. But what we selected the sort of 16-hour minimum because that aligns with some of the sort of thresholds in universal credit. But I think the most important thing with the living hours is making sure that workers have autonomy over the hours they want to work. So they have that security and predictability and stability. and basically can work the hours that they want to, that suits, you know, their different circumstances, because the way the benefit system works here is that it's very much dependent on your responsibilities, your age, who you are. So it's really about making sure that workers have that autonomy.
So much, Dan. And again, as I say, thank you to everybody who's taken part this evening. You've done a fantastic work. It's been our first webinar. I think it was a huge success, not just because I was the moderator, obviously, but because of all the panelists. But it's my birthday, so I'm just being nice to myself. But listen, before we go, because I know we have a huge amount of people watching, and our next webinar is on Monday, the 2nd of November, and this is coming Monday, entitled Funding a New Future for All, and features Michael Catt, the economist with SIP2, and Tom McDonough, director of NERI, who will discuss how we can best fund the agenda which we have set out. And of course, your local trade union, Trade Council, is working in your community to protect workers. So get in touch with them through your union, follow and support them on social media. And I know that the Galway Council of Trade Unions will have our Facebook website, our Facebook page up soon, thanks to Tom Brown. And I have to say it was absolutely fantastic. So also follow One Movement, One Cork, One Galway online, Facebook and Twitter, as their new events and materials are being developed for all the time for workers. So keep an eye out for those over the coming months. And of course, continue to encourage your family, friends and colleagues to join a union, because we all should. And as we've seen, especially through this pandemic, unions are the only people speaking up for workers, whether it's about safety in the workplace during the pandemic, increasing the pandemic payment, or ensuring that workers get the wages and best conditions possible during this time. And of course, sick leave has become a huge issue as well for people during this time with pandemic, and afraid to admit that they may have COVID because they need to go to work because they don't get sick pay. So of course, stay in touch. You can contact us at any time through Facebook or Twitter, and but you keep connected with your union. And also, I just want to say thanks to everybody, because I want to thank our wonderful panelists. Really and truly, you are phenomenal. I've learned so much myself this evening. John, Dan, Terence, Dolores, to Fiona, to Hazel, who organised the whole thing, and of course to Fosa, who organised it as well. And I just finally want to thank all the people who listened in. I thought it was brilliant. I thought the questions were fantastic. And remember, there is a pandemic. Just be very careful out there. Wear your mask. Keep your distance, wash your hands. And I want to say thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to the Galway Council of Trade Union. And for myself, Marion Spellman, President of the Galway Council of Trade Union, thanks so much and have a wonderful night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.